the success of liberty.
You have found the 22 November Network, the voice of the grassroots JFK research community. This is the Lone Gunman Podcast with your host, your boy, Rob Clark.
Oh, hello. What's up, everybody? And I hope you enjoyed my little opening there. I promise you it will sound better, hopefully by the next time I do this. Ran into a little technical difficulties this week. That's why I didn't put another one out earlier this week. I was moving, and I'm still waiting on Comcast to come hook my Wi-Fi up that they should have done on Tuesday. So I'm having issues with my tablet and trying to do this right. So I'm doing it the most ghetto way I know possible. It probably sounds like shit, but I promise it will get better. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Fred Lee Chrisman. And we're going to get into some taboo topics of the JFK assassination, including UFOs and Marilyn Monroe, and maybe some other things. Depends on if we got enough time or not. The one thing that is a taboo subject in the groups and forums is, of course, the UFO aspect of all this. And I'm not saying it's aliens. And I'm not saying, anything that aliens were responsible for the assassination, because they weren't. I'm just going to discuss it because it ties in with Fred Chrisman and some more obscure things you may not have heard about. So let's dive right in here because we got a lot of ground to cover. Mr. Fred Chrisman. The reason that I set my sights on him for this week is because we were introduced to him, of course, with the Garrison investigation. Garrison thought he was involved somehow. And, of course, Thomas Beckham implicates him in his HSCA testimony as being the head of this nefarious organization known as the Organization. Pretty ominous name there, huh? But he basically asserts that he was his handler. Beckham's, that is. And he pretty much told Beckham not to tell Garrison anything. And which he did. He didn't tell Garrison anything. He denied. And I believe Chrisman even talked to Garrison as well for his grand jury testimony. And I don't believe he told Garrison anything either. And an interesting fact is that the first person that Clay Shaw called after he was arrested was Fred Chrisman. And the first person, after he found out that the heat was coming down on him and that Garrison was on his trail that he wanted to track down and talk to, was Fred Chrisman. Now, why is that, you might say? Well, Thomas Beckham tells this story that they were in New Orleans in the offices of G. Ray Gill, who, of course, we know is Carlos Marcello's lawyer, and who David Ferry worked for. And this is, of course, in the same building, the Père Marquette building that Jim Braden had an office in. We talk about that in another podcast. But, so Beckham tells of Clay Shaw, David Ferry, G. Ray Gill, Vincent Marcello, not Carlos, Vincent, and having this little meeting there, getting this packet together, and they paid him $200 to take this envelope to Dallas 2 weeks before the assassination to Lawrence Howard, who was staying at the Executive Inn in Dallas. And he said when he got it there, Howard was pissed because something was missing or something wasn't right. And he said that the envelope contained pictures, diagrams, drawings, from like high buildings and trajectories and angles. And of course, looking back, he probably thinks it had something to do with the assassination, which I'm sure it did. And he tells of course, leaving New Orleans, and I think he settled in Kansas, and Chrisman was helping him move, between there, maybe Idaho, Nebraska, throughout the Midwest, just to kind of get away from things for a while. From his early travels, we know Chrisman came to New Orleans numerous times before the assassination. His official cover, I guess you would call it, was something, because he was in the armed forces. Now, Chrisman was in the military during World War II, and probably met a young fellow by the name of Clay Shaw, who was in the military at that time as well. They were both stationed in Germany. And as we know, Werner von Braun surrendered to Clay Shaw. And if you believe everything that you see and hear and read, the Nazis were developing UFOs. They were actively developing. Some say they even had them developed at the time of World War II. And if you follow the pattern of these Nazi UFOs like the Bell and the traditional disc-shaped UFOs, the main majority of the sightings started after the end of World War II. Now, you could claim that, of course, we enveloped all these Nazi scientists into our system and had them start working for us. So naturally, we would have gotten our hands on anything they would have already developed and anything that they were developing. And as we know, of course, Roswell happened in 1947. That's the famous UFO crash, right? Well, a couple days before Roswell occurred, Fred Chrisman, who had gotten out of the military by this time, was supposedly working up in Washington State, trolling a harbor up there with a buddy named Harold Dahl, and they were retrieving loose logs from the logging industry. And it was basically like they were basically scavengers, but they could still make money doing this by scavenging this loose lumber. These big companies might have lost a log or two here or there in the harbor, and these guys would come along and claim it, clean it up, drag it out, and sell it for lumber. And they claimed, him and Harold Dahl claimed that these UFOs were flying low over the sound, and it looked like one of them was in trouble, and it let loose some slag and paper-like material onto the deck of their ship. And Dahl claimed that it killed his dog, this stuff falling from this UFO, and injured his son in the process. And Harold Dahl, the next day, received a visit from what we now call Man in Black, who couldn't have possibly known about the incident yet. And this is the genesis of the infamous Man in Black scenario. And of course, the government found out about it. They sent 2 guys out to retrieve this slag and take reports from Chrisman and Dahl about this stuff. And so they obtained the slag, and on their way back, their plane crashes, and they die. And the stuff's never recovered. And then, of course, we have the Kenneth Arnold sighting the next day in Washington State, of course, again. And he sees UFOs as well. And this is, we first get the term flying saucer. I believe he coined that. And people have been calling them flying saucers ever since. And then, of course, a couple days later, we have Roswell, the supposed UFO crash. Now, where Marilyn Monroe comes into this, okay? I mean, it's pretty well known that JFK and Marilyn were, having relations off and on for a couple of years. And there's something called the Maryland UFO document, and I'll post all this relative stuff up on Facebook about it. And it basically was a report from a private investigator who had been hired by, I can't remember if it was the CIA or the FBI, to bug her home. And it said that she had told a friend of hers on the phone that JFK had toured a secret military installation and witnessed firsthand crashed UFOs and dead alien bodies. And it was, of course, the events surrounding her death are mysterious as well, because we have now the same guy that was doing the wiretapping on her house also managed to capture, now this is all according to him, a conversation between Marilyn and Robert Kennedy, who was at her house earlier the day that she died, with Peter Lawford, where, Bobby was trying to do his brother a favor and try to get Marilyn, because she was getting to the point where she was like frantic because JFK started ignoring her. He wouldn't return her calls, he wouldn't take her calls, he wasn't seeing her anymore, and she was kind of in love with the fact that JFK would leave Jackie and she would be the first lady, and who knows if she really loved him or not. It's hard to say, but apparently when Bobby and Peter Lawford went to see her that day, she lost it because Bobby told her, look, Jack wants nothing to do with you. You're cut off. Don't call him anymore. It's over. It's done. It's, nothing is ever going to be the same. And that she went hysterical, pulled a knife and tried to kill him, and Peter Lawford had to pull her off of him. And she threatened to expose all these secrets that Jack told her, and said she'd been keeping them all in a little red diary, and all this crazy stuff, which kind of comes up missing later that night. And then we know that Bobby and Peter Lawford were in the area. They were pulled over for speeding later on that night, about midnight. Marilyn died about 10:15 that evening. But her body, she wasn't reported as something being wrong until like 4 a.m. because her psychiatrist had come over. Her maid had found her, and they moved her from the guest house to her main bedroom and locked the doors it's just a crazy scenario. And if you want to know more about how Marilyn died, and you feel free to Google it, but this is what this private detective was asserting, that she was going to spill the beans, she was going to hold a press conference and tell the world all this stuff because she was so distraught. Now, we have another document from probably about 2 weeks before the assassination, where JFK was requesting all information on unidentified flying objects from the CIA. Anything they had, he wanted it. And whether you believe that, if there's aliens or if it was actually Nazi technology that we had adopted, and I mean, you can't discount the hundreds of thousands of sightings of these things throughout the years, since Roswell happened. Now whether it's our technology or alien technology, or if one just happened to land and we reverse engineered it to the point where we could, we went far above and beyond our own means in recreating this thing, then, that's a possibility too. But getting back to Fred Chrisman for a minute, it's odd that while he was in Washington State, Clay Shaw was stationed in Washington State. Guy Bannister was in the FBI and stationed in Washington State. And Jim Garrison was working for the FBI and in Washington State. Okay, and it just seems really, really odd to me that these four guys, who obviously knew each other, would all be stationed, and of course they would all have a date with destiny and a date with fate many years later, 20 years later, and that they were all stationed in Washington State at the same time, at about the time that, these UFO sightings were going on. You might say Garrison. Yeah, Garrison worked for the FBI as an investigator for the FBI before he became a lawyer and eventually a judge. And so the Maury Island sightings happened while Fred Chrisman was on, after he'd gotten out of the service. And then a couple years later, he re-enlists in the service. And he gets out again, like in the early 60s. And becomes a substitute teacher. Okay? Which is very, very part-time work, which leaves him a lot of free time. He was traveling a lot. And his alibi, of course, for the Kennedy assassination was that he was substitute teaching in Washington State that day. And he had a form or a document to prove it, which we all know can be faked. And if the organization was an element, within military intelligence or the CIA or a combination of both, something that he might have been running, it's kind of odd. Now, we also have reports, and I think they were brought up in the Torba document, that Chrisman was one of the tramps. Now, I've gone over the tramps before in this podcast, and I don't believe that Fred Chrisman was one of the tramps that was photographed that day. But that's not to say that he wasn't part of the other ones that weren't. Okay? Because we have not only the three famous tramps we have pictures of in Dealey Plaza, there was also other ones that were not photographed and were let go pretty much as soon as they were brought into the station. And Fred Chrisman was alleged to have been one of these people. Now, whether it was or not, I don't know. Now, also, as we know from, I talked about in the past podcast, that Fred Chrisman was instrumental in getting these fake bishops set up in New Orleans with these fake churches. And Thomas Beckham even talks about that as well in his HSCA testimony. And something interesting that I ran across was that there was a church right at the end of the alleyway beside where J.D. Tippett was murdered. It was called the Abundant Life Church. And it was a 4-story building. And whoever killed Tippett ran down the alley there, took off their jacket, and threw it under a vehicle close by this Abundant Life Church. Now, we have reports of somebody going in the church. It could have been like a temporary hideout for whoever shot Tippett. But that seems odd to me too, because this is supposedly Chrisman's baby hit this Abundant Life Church there in Dallas, and it just seems really odd that, the police were responding to somebody holding up in a church, at the library, and they had to break off when they heard they had the suspect in the theater. So take that for what you will. Now, we know Fred Chrisman was a right-wing supporter. Later on in his life, in the early 70s, he had his own talk show in Washington State. It was a very right-wing political talk show, and which could, of course, associate him with other extreme right-wingers that myself and Doug have fingered in all this, like General Walker, all these anti-Castro Cubans with their extreme ideals and, anti-left stance, anti-Kennedy stance. And Beckham described Chrisman as always being very confident, very knowledgeable, very well dressed, very polite until he got upset. And he got very, very, it's like flipping a switch almost. And we've been searching and searching and searching for the architect or architects of the assassination. And Thomas Beckham gives it to us on a platter. And people tend to say that, Beckham is not credible. He didn't give Garrison anything, and so years later he makes this story up, to maybe try to make himself famous and make money off the story or something like that. But I think it's more Chrisman, Shaw, and Ferry are dead by now, and he's given immunity for his testimony, so he opens up, and he just, because it's probably been eating on him for years, about his involvement and people he knows involvement, and it's probably been eating at this poor guy for years about what happened, and he's finally given the chance to say it and basically be immune from prosecution for his testimony. And I think he takes the opportunity. Now the question, of course, becomes, is it true? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it gives us all the right elements. It gives us all the right people involved. And it sets up a pretty interesting narrative. And for Garrison to have had his sights on Chrisman and think he was involved in some way says a lot to me, because Garrison really knew what he was talking about. And, he investigated things that the Warren Commission never thought of. And, he got us a lot of really interesting testimony. I mean, he couldn't get anything from these two guys, but he laid a bit more of the groundwork in the people that were involved in New Orleans in this thing. And it's very clear to me that Shaw and Chrisman knew each other. We know Shaw knew Ferry, which means they all three knew each other. They knew Oswald, which means they all knew each other. They knew Beckham, which means they all knew each other. And they all knew G. Ray Gill, who worked for Marcello. Now we know Shaw and Ferry and Chrisman all had ties to the CIA and the intelligence services. Okay? We know that Shaw and Chrisman were buddies from way back when they served in World War II. And it obviously kept in touch if that's the first person that Clay Shaw called was his buddy Fred Chrisman, this substitute teacher in Washington. It says a lot to me. And to go a step further now, and I got to credit my buddy Pat Beaumier for this. And if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Pat, I apologize. He's got one of them Frenchy names, Pat Beaumier, something like that. But Pat, you know who you are. And Pat must be psychic or something, because I knew I was going to talk about Fred Chrisman today. And Pat sent me a Facebook message today speaking exactly of this stuff. And touching on a little bit of what I was going to touch about today, which is strange, is how fate works, or maybe Pat's just psychic. Who knows? But he reminded me of course, we know D.H. Byrd, owned the Texas School Book Depository, and maybe you've heard of his relatives, his cousins. I think it was his cousins. Admiral Richard Byrd. And what's the other guy's name? I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, I'm familiar with Admiral Byrd because he's from where I live. We have schools named after him, statues of him in town. And, he's one of our claims to fame, I guess you could say. I mean, I even went to school with a kid named Bird when I was in high school, who was a relative of them. And there was a thing right after World War II called Operation High Jump, where they sent Admiral Byrd to Antarctica to see if some Nazis had escaped there after the war, and because there was rumblings that they had escaped there either by submarine or UFO, and had these secret UFO bases in Antarctica, or secret bases, and that they were continuing, to work on things down there. And of course, we know that part of his Operation High Jump thing was to find these moon rocks that had came down, as part of that fell off the moon, and they would come through, and they were easily found down there because, of course, it's a wasteland. It's a snow-covered, ice-covered wasteland, and there is no vegetation. So things like meteors and meteorites and things that fall to the earth are easily visible down there and are easily obtained, and is thought to be a source of the moon rocks that we supposedly brought back from our trip to the moon, which I think is fake, by the way. But this is a JFK related podcast, but maybe we'll touch on it in the future of how I think it's fake, because JFK ties in a little bit, because he pretty much stated we were going to have a man on the moon in 10 years. So they kind of had to make it happen by 1969. But anyway, like I said, we might visit that in a future podcast. But as it relates to, of course, high jump and these Nazis and the birds, everything kind of ties together in this weird, fringy kind of way. And like I said, it's a taboo topic to talk about. in the groups and forums. You bring it up, you're immediately labeled a crazy person. But Jim Marrs has a good book. It's called Alien Agenda, and it touches on a lot of this stuff and a lot of the people involved in it. And for Fred Chrisman to be involved in this weird UFO sighting, a little bit before Roswell, just seems like a sore thumb and kind of odd to me. That he would be involved in that and then somehow be involved in the Kennedy assassination and be no more than this, innocent substitute teacher. And why would Thomas Beckham pick this guy out of obscurity to say that he was the head of this organization, that was, behind all this stuff? It seems to me there's got to be some kind of weight behind it, some kind of kernel of truth in the story. You don't have to buy the whole story, because Chrisman was famous for his writings. He claimed to find a hole in Alaska, which is where he was sent when he re-enlisted, that went into the Middle Earth, and then he came across these beings in the Middle Earth, and he wrote these fantastic stories, and then he submitted to these pulp fiction magazines back in the 50s. It's really weird out there stuff that, I don't know if he was writing fiction or if it was personal experiences or what it was supposed to be. But we know he was a fantastic thinker. The question is, was he a fantastic doer? Was he on the ground in Dealey Plaza? Was he one of the tramps that wasn't photoed? Was he running Thomas Beckham? Was he responsible for these fake churches and these fake bishops and kind of organizing things in between Dallas and New Orleans? That's the question. We know he spent significant time in both places. And like I said before, running these churches and setting up the guys that he needed as these fake pastors and bishops and priests is that it created a network where operatives could go city by city, state by state, and have a safe haven, have a place to go where they could trust, had people that were there that they could trust and knew the deal. And these priests and bishops and everything themselves had incredible access to pretty much anything, and pretty much freedom to travel wherever they wanted. This includes foreign countries. This includes, going into hospitals to people's deathbeds and, have people tell them things that they wouldn't tell anybody else because they trusted them. And it's a pretty damn good idea, if you ask me, to set up these fake churches all over the place. And it was a good way to also raise money. Because as you know, if you've ever been to a church, they've always got that played out and want money. And now, it would appear that some of these fake churches in New Orleans didn't even have any parishioners. They were just, there in name and building alone. But this church in Dallas was different. It actually had parishioners. It had a priest. And I'm sure it took in money. And this is just a couple of them. Beckham said that Chrisman had these things all through the South. So it gives you something to think about. It's another aspect to the assassination that, like I said, that hasn't been talked about much. It doesn't get much play, but it involves some of the main characters that we know. And it's another piece to the puzzle that we can hopefully fit together and make some sense out of this thing. And I'm going to post up, again, Thomas Beckham's HSCA testimony. And you can read for yourself what he says about Fred Chrisman. And I discovered something today that Thomas Beckham actually wrote a book. It was called something Remnants of Truth, maybe. And I've yet to get my hands on it. So if anybody knows of any free PDFs that are out there on the web of this thing, or transcripts or summaries or anything, and it's spelled awkwardly. It's like BECK''HAM as the author, Thomas Beckham. But yeah, that's out there too. The Torbit document, if you could find it, is a good read. It tells a lot about Chrisman and organizing things between Dallas and New Orleans. And then, of course, after assassination, we have Chrisman being implicated in something called as being part of the octopus. And this is some crazy stuff. And I will post a link to the octopus article up on Facebook as well, and you can read about that. It's craziness, and it's crazy because it deals with like the Inslaw case, and it pervaded for decades and touched a lot of people, and it's crazy because supposedly somebody involved with it, I can't remember if it was a journalist that was covering the story or not. I think it was. But anyway, he ended up supposedly committing suicide in a hotel not too far from where I live in West Virginia. I live in Virginia, but it's close to West Virginia. So yeah, I mean it's crazy, and it's all of course, the octopus has tentacles all over the place, and that's what the main gist of this thing is. But I'll post that up, and you can read through that. So if you hear Fred Chrisman's name again, don't dismiss it. Hear what is said about it. See what people have to say about Fred Chrisman. Like I said, Garrison thought he was involved, and they quite possibly could have known each other. Like I said, Garrison and Bannister were stationed in Washington State at the same time. Clay Shaw was stationed in Washington State at the same time as Bannister and Garrison, and Chrisman was there. So that right there is what I like to call a crazy connection of these four people, that quite possibly could have been intertwined and had impacts, of course, later on, 20 years later, when it comes to the Kennedy case. And when the UFO stuff gets involved, but we know Chrisman was involved in the Maury Island incident. We have the Operation Paperclip guys and Von Braun surrendering to Clay Shaw. Okay. And, all these guys, or Chrisman and Shaw, were in the service together. And we know the Nazis were developing UFO technology. So it's a crazy, crazy web of stuff to think about. And I lay it in your lap humbly and tell you, think about it. Because, once again, the implications of all this stuff are far-reaching. They are crazy. And, of course, some people are going to say, Rob, you're an idiot to believe in any of this UFO nonsense. It's not that I believe in UFOs. I think it relates to the case because the people involved were related to the UFOs. Even JFK was wondering about UFOs. He supposedly told Marilyn Monroe he'd been to a secret base, and seen alien bodies and crashed UFOs. This is coming from Marilyn's mouth to her friend, unprompted. Okay, so it's stuff is not out there totally. Now, whether it was alien bodies or whether it was Nazi technology, truly, of course we don't know yet. It would seem to me that it would be Nazi technology. because of the bell, and we've had sightings of the bell in America. Of course, after World War II, the Nazi flying saucer, we got pictures of that. It was really and truly developed. I don't know if it had capabilities, like the UFOs we see or people see today. That can go, super fast, disappear, hover silently, move in any direction, turn on a dime, stuff like that. I don't know. But as you know, we sucked up all of the Nazi scientists that were, centered around developing rockets and aerospace technologies and designing UFOs and rockets. And Clay Shaw accepted their surrender, and Chrisman was there. Clay Shaw, the first person Clay Shaw called was Fred Chrisman, which tells you a lot. Okay, that means that Chrisman would have been a man who knew what to do, who knew what to say, because he did the same with Thomas Beckham. So take it for what you will. Think about it. I'm going to post everything up on Facebook. Thank you to Pat Beaumier for reminding me of the bird and Operation High Jump and the Nazi bases down there, UFOs possibly down there. And look forward to Doug and his excellent podcast, The Dallas Action. I believe he's going to have one coming later tonight or tomorrow. Look for him on Black Op Radio every month or close thereabouts to it. And please keep liking and sharing our podcasts everywhere you can. If you enjoy them, other people will too. And they don't have to be JFK buffs, okay? Hopefully they can learn something from this stuff, because the JFK assassination and the people that did it are still in control of the country today as we speak. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. The control is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And the more people we make aware of this stuff, the better. But yes, and thank you to Adam Webb of the Web of Conspiracy podcast. You can find here on Spreaker for his generous shout outs to the Lone Gunman podcast 2 weeks ago. I very much appreciate it. It was very much felt. And if any of my listeners would like to expand their conspiracy knowledge, I highly recommend Adam's show, The Web of Conspiracy. That's Web with 2 B's. So please check him out. He's doing good things over there. And his following is growing every day. And me and Doug appreciate everybody that listens and shares and comments, interacts. That's what we're here for. We like talking about this stuff, and hopefully you'd like to listen and talk too. So any comments about the show, hit me up in the comments section, send me an email, head to the Facebook page. It's all streamlined right there on Spreaker for you on my info page. Everything is one click away. I couldn't make it easier for you if I tried. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out Doug's podcast, The Dallas Action. Hopefully we'll have some big news here to drop on you. As you heard in the intro, this is the 22 November Network. This is the voice of the grassroots research community. And you are a part of it, people. Don't ever forget that. Until next time, this sumbitch is in the can, beamed to the satellite, down to your ears. This is Rob Clark, out.